Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining for today's webinar. We're going to wait a couple of more minutes to get started so that participants are able to join. So just hang tight and we'll get started here in a couple of minutes. Thanks.
Okay, everyone, I think we're going to get started. So first off, I want to say hello. Welcome to our eLab webinar series. Thanks so much for joining us today. Today's webinar is being hosted by our eLab team. We're devoted to low-income energy issues and opportunities in the US. So this webinar is about business models that are emerging to serve low-income customers, which to date have not had many clean energy options. My name is Kendall Ernst, and I'm here with Kareena Chan.
Hi.
From the eLab Leap team at Rocky Mountain Institute. We'll be facilitating this webinar today, and Kareena and I will be handing it back and forth so we can spice it up a little bit for you. We have 1 hour today for this webinar. Our goal is to get a lively discussion going with 4 experts we have on the line, and to provide some insight into several business models that we've profiled in our Breaking Ground report. While we're talking, people on the line, please feel free to type questions into the question box at any time. We'll be collecting questions on our side, and our team over here will do our best to answer those, as many of those as we can by the end of the webinar.
So maybe a little context before we dive into the content. Our goal in eLab Leap is to support collaboration and solutions that empower and improve the lives of low-income households in a clean energy future. So one program focus for us is our Social Change Lab, which we have in the state of New York, and we convene a range of key stakeholders and support their capacity to develop new relationships between each other and work together in new ways. So in that lab, we work with over 40 individuals in government, from utilities, community-based orgs, advocates, service providers, and a whole host of other stakeholders who represent clean energy experts and low-income family and community experts. We believe this method could be scaled to other states to support unique working partnerships and friendships. Our other program focus is to help support the emergence of new business models to serve this low-income sector. And this includes doing research to inform the energy industry and to stimulate dialogue like this about market opportunities that could benefit low-income communities and households.
Which brings us to our Breaking Ground report. This is our first publication, and we're focusing on this today. The report reviews 4 emerging business models, which range from concepts to pilots. And although government oftentimes plays a role, these are revenue-driven models that involve private capital, and they offer an insight into one way the industry could provide for low-income customers in terms of access to DERs. We've been getting a lot of questions about how and what these models do to drive this access. So this webinar will provide a bit of insight into some of the decisions and challenges behind the models based on what people have been asking us about. We're not going to review each model in detail, although we hope that if you haven't read the report, this is a teaser and you'll follow it up with a read.
One of the most important things for us to share about our research is things we see in common about how these models are, at a high level, beginning to work and beginning to address barriers for low-income customers. One of the people in our lab we work with, a fellow named Chris Neidel in Solar One, he calls these kinds of models new species of business models, sort of the next generation after more established models that are currently serving higher income families and businesses. And that's an analogy, the species or evolution, that's been helpful for us to think about how markets are evolving, like growing an arm here, a leg there, or sprouting new functions to adapt and serve low-income households specifically. And we're seeing 4 main ways these models are adapting. Number 1, they're transforming what is considered valuable. And this means they're finding unconventional sources of value, like existing social networks and communities, community-based labor, assets, other things that are worth money, and finding ways to monetize that value. The second, they are reorganizing how stakeholders work with each other. And that can mean they redefine how existing stakeholders work together, or often they're also introducing new third-party stakeholders. And this enables new kinds of transactions, new kinds of exchanges, resources, monitoring. They are 3, aggregating many customers at once. This one is quite simple to understand. They access many customers at one time to encourage economies of scale and other efficiencies that reduce costs. And finally, they're diversifying, both on the customer side and the investor side. And they could include multiple customer types, or, and more often, and different investors with different investment criteria in a single project type to manage and reduce risks. So let's switch now to our panelists and hear from them their views on how these concepts are shaking out on the ground.
So panelists, it's really great to have you on the line. We're going to ask you guys each 2 short check-in questions after I introduce you with a brief slide, and that will help give our audience a better idea of who you are and what your work is. So first we have Isaac Baker. He's a founding member of CoOp Power and their co-director of Community Solar. CoOp Power's co-op owner model offers offers low-income customers access to community solar. They do that through a prepay or pay-as-you-go subscription. In addition to subscribing to community solar, customers have an opportunity to co-own the project through an ownership flip. So Isaac, if you could unmute, what's your role in developing the model? And in 1 sentence, if you could answer, what's been the hardest part about developing this model from your view?
Hi, everyone. Kendall, thank you for the introduction, and it's wonderful to be on with you all. my role in developing this, I was a founding member of CoOp Power many years ago and have had a lot of my early work opportunities in my career through CoOp Power. And after helping do a few other projects with CoOp Power, I was hired on to help the cooperative think about how to solve some of these issues we were seeing in the solar market. Massachusetts has had community solar for a number of years, and a lot of it was being done by much larger energy developers and typically selling to higher income customers. And so I was hired on 2 years ago to start thinking about how we can think about some of these new models or these new species that could help deliver this value to our co-op members, which are about 600 that we have to date, nonprofits and homeowners alike, and then also to think about scalable ways we can continue to deliver this to our multi-class and multi-race group of stakeholders. So after about 2 years, as was indicated, we came out with basically an option that's maximizes benefit for folks who have upfront resources to put into a project, and an option that's more accessible on a pay-as-you-go basis for lower income folks. And out of that, and I would say, while we have some off-the-shelf options, it's been incredibly challenging, and it's really the Wild West out there. So these are evolving species, very much so right now, and there's a lot of learning that's continuing to go on, but we're excited to have in place what we do. And I'd say the biggest challenge simply has been the tax credit. The fact of the federal solar tax credit that we have is a great thing in a lot of ways, but it is a deeply unequal thing, and it's really hard to and expensive to figure out how to use that tax credit on behalf of folks like nonprofits or low-income people who don't pay federal taxes. And that really is the work of the business model, is trying to design around this problem and opportunity that was set up by the federal government through the way that we incentivize solar.
Thanks, Isaac. Next, we have McGowan Southworth, who's a founding partner of Brooklyn Power. We call his model the building co-op model because it partners with co-op boards of buildings in New York City. Working through these boards and building co-op structures, the model provides low-income customers pass-through access to loans, incentives, and other benefits to enable multifamily solar. So same two questions for you, McGowan. What is your role in developing the model? And in one sentence, what's been the hardest part about putting this concept in place from your role?
Yeah, it's a great. Those are great questions. My role getting involved in this was simply as a board member of my co-op. I lived in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, where they have self-managed co-ops. It's pretty old school, and we were just trying to put an asset that we had to use, and that was not common practice at the time. So we had to figure out how to side of putting panels on an urban building and intertying it across to benefit multi-users, and then the tax equity side and the finance just about. And we definitely recognizing that there's a lot of buildings that had left out of the renewable energy paradigm shift, or I should say distributed energy paradigm shift, and a lot of those buildings started calling us, and that was the start of Brooklyn Power. The challenges, I think it was well put that it's the Wild West out there, and so we continue to learn, and I think we continue to adjust as we learn, and I think that's important. There's a lot of different structures, ownership structures within buildings, just in New York City, which is where we're mostly focused.
Thanks for going.
So being flexible and being creative to solve those problems, both from a design perspective, from an equity perspective, and a financing perspective.
Thanks, McGowan. Also, if we could perhaps have you call in rather than call through your computer. We're having a slight bit of technical difficulty on our side. So if you could call into the webinar, that'd be helpful.
And maybe mute your screen while you're doing that.
So next we have Kieran Pullman on the line. Kieran is a colleague here at RMI who's working closely with several partners in Rochester to create the concept for a worker co-op model. And you've noticed me saying co-op a fair number of times. We've also noticed this, and we might get into some of those intricacies a little bit later. This model leverages community resources in order to reduce costs, or reduce the overall project costs of a project, with an opportunity for local economic development and also for customers to co-own a piece of the project. Kieran, same questions for you. What's your role in developing the model? And in one sentence, what's been the hardest part about putting this concept in place?
Great. Thanks, Kendall Kareena. Getting into our role in the model, I think it's useful to provide some context about the SHINE Community Solar Program at RMI. So the SHINE Community Scale Solar Initiative believes that there are many ways through the vehicle of community solar to accelerate the reduction, the cost reduction in solar, above and beyond what we've seen in kind of the hard cost reduction of the past few years, so specifically addressing soft costs. So with regard to partner communities in Rochester and Central New York, we've served as a strategic advisor to better understand what levers buyers can pull, so those who are ultimately paying for the power, to reduce the total cost of ownership of the systems that they are buying power as an off-taker. So we see there as being buyer-owned levers, seller-owned levers, and shared levers to cost reduction that community solar is uniquely situated to address. The hardest part in implementing this model on our side has been kind of understanding the effective allocation of roles, responsibilities, and risks among existing and what I think is an appropriate analog of the new species of models that are emerging and as one. So as a new species of model, how can risks and roles be allocated to reduce costs effectively? Thanks. Go ahead, Kendall. Moving along.
Great, thanks. Sorry, having some technical trouble on the side. Finally, we have Jeff Waller joining us. Jeff is a principal in RMI Sustainable Finance Practice. Jeff, just one question for you. What are the financing needs you see for these kinds of business models?
Thanks, Kendall. Good afternoon, everyone. So the main financing needs for these business models may include construction financing, so to procure equipment, build a project, any legal or development costs would be covered under a construction loan. Term financing, so once the construction loan or the construction rather is complete, a longer-term loan repays the construction loan, and that new loan is repaid over time from project revenues on an amortized basis. Tax equity financing, as someone referenced earlier, this helps to monetize the federal tax credits and incentives. And in some cases, you may have subscription financing, so a way to help subscribers pay for prepaid subscriptions.
All right, thanks everyone for those intros. Okay, now we're officially in the discussion portion of our agenda. So just some quick ground rules to our panelists. Kendall and I will either direct questions to you individually by name or indicate when we would like to hear all your perspectives in turn. That's just to avoid some confusion. Also, please keep your mics muted when you're not speaking to prevent feedback. And last but not least, if you feel like our question isn't quite nailing the crux of the issue on the head, feel free to adjust or pivot to bring what you feel are the most important points up to our listeners. So let's start with starting up. One of the first things we noticed was how few entrepreneurs comparatively there are in this field. And one obvious guess is that it's fairly difficult to start up a business model that serves low-income customers. So Isaac, if we can start with you. What's your experience in startup for your model? What's made it really hard in the beginning?
That is a great question. I would say that the biggest barriers to entry in solar right now, as that we've found in working specifically on the project financing side, really trying to figure out how to deliver these models. I think there are other ways where folks can get involved with solar just in doing customer acquisition or finding sites, finding customers. But if you want to actually be the developer who as our cooperative did, the biggest barrier at that level was the amount of legal time we spent. So we were fortunate to have a lot of pro bono legal that got us to where we are, but that was far and away the biggest headache, was moving. We spent about a year on the phone with a lot of different teams of lawyers to try and get all of this together, and that was if we had not had as much pro bono legal as we did, we would not have been able to do any of this work. And even with it, it took an amazing amount of time and still a pretty good amount of startup resources just to pay staff to stick around for more or less a year without any tangible results before we really started building some projects. So that was probably the biggest barrier, was legal and having enough runway financing and folks putting that upfront money in who really believed that there was something worthy on the other end of that year's worth of research and development.
Kieran, the concept for your model is similar in many ways to Isaac's. So could you share, do you feel similarly about startup hurdles? What have you been experiencing? I know you've been doing a lot of on-the-ground work with Rockspot.
Sure. I would certainly agree with Isaac's comments. I think the legal issues are critical when it comes to kind of raising and investing capital in any projects. Similarly, I would say that in the Rochester case, there was difficulty in kind of successfully following through on the original plan to source capital from the community itself in a way that, leveraging the tax liability of local investors who had also a strategic interest in providing lower cost power to their fellow residents. So, at the individual scale of one-off high net worth individuals, it's very difficult to understand whether they actually, in a timely and standardized way, to understand whether they actually have the tax liability necessary to both draw down on the investment tax credit and the depreciation benefits that come with the recent extension of tax credits.
Thanks, Kieran. McGowan was going to ask you a follow-up question to Kieran. Just want to check in. Can you say a few words so we can hear your audio and hear if it's coming in clear?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, perfect. Okay. So you have a number of projects around New York City. What's your perspective on starting up?
Yeah, the biggest challenge for us has been more of the design build side, just the urban environment requiring a little bit non-traditional solar installation. So that's been the biggest challenge, and in order to sort of move that ball forward, it required a lot of raising of awareness to the industry, both the solar industry and then I guess the nonprofits who are pushing solar and the government agencies that support it. But in terms of the financing, that's probably the least of our problems.
Interesting. Okay. Well, Jeff, based on what you're hearing, what are some of your thoughts? We'll take any, but if you'd like to lead, how you see potentially the ways for industry and government to support entrepreneurs.
So I think starting from the government side, sort of see two kind of buckets there. One is green banks or other sort of infrastructure banks can really play a role to help mitigate some of the risks that may be inhibiting commercial lenders from financing these sorts of projects. That's not to suggest that green banks have to assume all these financing needs, but they can provide some targeted facilities that backstop some of the revenue risks. For example, they could provide a debt service reserve or another liquidity facility to cover potential revenue shortfalls for a particular portion or a subset of the customers. Another potential role for government or government entity is to use its own creditworthiness to bolster the risk profile of transactions or to bring down financing costs. So, for example, a creditworthy government entity can be a purchaser of distributed power alongside low-income residents, like as an anchor tenant or otherwise. This can help diversify the offtake risk and make it a little more palatable or perceived as less risky from the perspective of lenders and tax equity investors. The involvement of government entities in these business models, whether they're municipalities or housing authorities, they can attract lower cost financing because they have general credit worthiness and existing relationships with municipal lenders. There's already a market there that's already used to financing them. And then I would say on the industry side, market players can do a better job at seeking sources of financing for these business models that have not been to date traditional lenders to distributed generation projects, but they may be a particularly good fit in the LMI context. So I'm thinking in particular of commercial banks with robust urban investment or community reinvestment act departments. For these sorts of lenders or these departments and banks, these are the sorts of projects that are arguably more of a natural fit than with the bank's energy finance team, for example, in terms of deal size. Wow.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. That's really helpful, and we may get into this some more. We've been hearing a lot more about how impact investors are helping to fill in some of the spaces in these models where, let's say, a portion of the model is particularly unconventional. That may be one investor class who's willing to be more flexible. And you and I have talked about this offline, and if there's time today, I'd love to circle back to that as well.
Sure thing.
Great. So moving on to our next set of questions. We've seen from our own experiences that getting from concept to test or pilot can require really a lot of pivots and new inventions. And it can be quite challenging. So I'm going to open this question up to all the panelists. Just remember to unmute when you're talking and mute when you're not talking. So the question is, what are major changes or innovations that you've made or are making moving from concept to pilot?
And by that you mean, by concept to pilot, it's like from sort of concept on paper versus a constructed project.
Exactly. The idea you originally had to what you think might be out there in the real world.
Sure. This is Kieran. I'm happy to kick that off. I think I wouldn't necessarily say this is a change from our original model to what we're currently working on, but with regards to the worker-owned co-op portion of this model in particular, understanding how solar procurement and development can coincide with and leverage broader employment efforts that is like something like the city of Rochester is working on to increase employment opportunities in its community, as well as kind of nascent climate action plans like the city of Rochester is currently developing. Was a challenge and also an opportunity for these set of projects. What I would also say, around creating a worker-owned co-op that would leverage sort of the demand for labor for the development of solar projects, as well as the demand for labor for kind of retrofits of commercial and municipal buildings. There's a great opportunity there for sort of a green construction company that the city of Rochester has identified an opportunity to help support with startup costs, with an understanding that it could, in the end, be a lower cost service than what might otherwise be the case when you're bringing in EPC companies from outside the city itself. And so there's certain ways of kind of bringing in and working with the existing stakeholders and leveraging both their buying power and demand for both electricity and energy efficiency services that can really help bring down the total cost of ownership for solar projects and create jobs for the community.
This is Isaac. I wanted to throw in a few quick thoughts there. We've had, I would say, pivoting is exactly the right word to use. And one of the main ways that we've had to pivot is we've seen in some of the states we're working in where the solar policy seems to change once every 3 months, which means that it requires a whole new strategy in some circumstances. And one of those big changes came around this past year where the IRS handed down a private letter ruling saying that after we had just invested a year and a half of time in looking into a direct ownership model for shared solar that would be a kind of prepaid subscription, as we had originally made it, we found out that we could now actually, as of this private letter ruling in late 2015, distribute tax credits out to off-takers in a community solar project. So that was a big pivot that we had to make just about 3 months ago with our direct ownership model, where we are now have a model that distributes the residential tax credit and other solar benefits all out to members. So that was one big pivot that came for us. Another one really related to what Kieran was just talking about was the thinking about that partnering with folks on the ground is something that we saw a lot of other solar folks are trying to develop these turnkey services where they come into communities with a kind of standard offer and are not, but what we've seen a lot more benefit in is in partnering with folks, existing businesses, existing nonprofits, and existing advocacy groups that already have relationships on the ground and already have a lot of the ingredients of a good solar project. So what that was for us was thinking about breaking down the solar development process of finding a site and finding customers and finding a local contractor and really partnering with nonprofits as well. And a final thing that we looked into relates to what was just said a little bit earlier, but thinking about that credit enhancement. So on the pay-as-you-go model, one of our slight innovations that we came up with in the last 6 months was to figure out, even in the low-income owner-occupied rooftop solar market, to try and figure out how we use a municipal partnership as an off-taker who can effectively provide credit enhancement by buying some portion of the solar off the array to make a project on a low-income homeowner's roof actually financeable where it has not been financed before. So those are just 3 quick pivots that we've made.
McGowan especially, I know from our discussions you've made quite a few pivots. Do you have anything you'd like to add here?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the most part, we started out with a lot of ideas and some that we're pretty psyched to see other people do, like the worker model. For us, what became more practical for us was really getting the meter side worked out. So net metering provided a lot of, or net metering on the commercial rates caused a lot of issues that we didn't expect, and so we had to do a lot of workarounds with that, with the virtual net metering and then the remote net metering, monetary crediting versus volumetric. So we've had to rejigger our models a lot because of the laws around net metering that don't really consider multifamily as residential but as commercial. So that's been one issue, and then the other is just on the build. We just had we had a real hard time getting contractors to come in and build the work because they had sort of been conditioned that co-ops are a really difficult market to engage. So we've had to get into the build side now as well.
Great. And Jeff, from our perspective, it might be good to know some ways that models like these, or these models particularly, might be able to flex or have these pivots in order to be more fundable from a financier's perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think as a general, piece of advice, I would say that as there are changes in the business model, it's important to kind of check in with, either existing financing partners or other folks in the financing world that you've been talking to, just to make sure, that the business model, as it changes, is still either financeable. You may be opening up new financing opportunities. For example, if you bring in, let's say, a municipal off-taker, that might open up, as we mentioned earlier, some municipal finance lenders or other markets that you may not have been targeting earlier from a financing perspective. And obviously, sometimes financing itself can become the cause of a pivot if if a particular model fails to gain traction among financing players, or maybe changes to the model in order to be able to attract that financing. But I think in general, input from financing partners as the models get refined over time can be really helpful to make sure that the models can attract capital as the projects look to scale.
Thanks, Jeff. There, and as people are speaking, in some ways I wish we were all in person because we could really take some of these threads and animate them and get some huge discussion about it. But I think if we can keep pushing on some of the questions that we have in mind, we may be able to get some good breath here for our listeners. So this next question is for the whole panel again. How do you logistically see your model scaling? So what's required for that to work in your minds? Feel free to unmute and address that question again. How do you logistically see your own model scaling, and what do you think is required for that to work?
I'd be happy just to jump in quickly, thinking about CoOp Power right now, and this is Isaac speaking. The biggest barrier that we've seen to scaling right now is basically on the site development side, and we're working with, and I would echo a sentiment that came earlier that said the value of impact investors in this space, and that everything we've been able to do has been because of impact investors willing to look at much smaller, more high-impact projects than any traditional financier would even come close to. And that's the most important thing in starting up solar is it takes a while in order to get to scale and to develop a team that's experienced and is able to build these larger projects. So having investors who are willing to work with you on those smaller projects has been huge. And then in terms of what we're really focused on is getting a team to scale where we can start building these larger projects and tapping those more traditional sources of financing as we get bigger. And the biggest impediment to that is basically the amount of policy change that's creating a lot of risk in the market, or perceived risk. And then really the cost of developing these larger sites and the amount of risk that those come with. What we would like to be able to do at some point would be to be able to build 2-megawatt sites, right, which is like a 10-acre solar farm, and that would be very cheap to develop and would be able to deliver low-cost power to low-income residents, and it's kind of the most affordable way to do community solar. And the problem with that is that can cost anywhere from $300,000 to $700,000 to develop and interconnect and permit a site like that, and that money is entirely at risk. And so having community-oriented institutions who have backing like that to go after developing sites of that nature has been, for us, the problem to solve in terms of thinking about scale, where we know how to do the work, we know how to get there, and there's just a lot of risk capital between us and successful implementation right now.
Yeah, echoing those last points that Isaac made, which I thought were really good ones. I think a challenge that I didn't mention earlier, but also one that could help unlock scale, is that very pre-development capital when oriented towards community groups, nonprofits, AHJs being authorities having jurisdiction, others who are well situated to help address some of those development barriers, like permitting, zoning, and in some places for kind of rural electric utilities or municipalities, interconnection, right? Understanding where solar should actually be interconnected to provide grid benefits. And I think we see a really good example of one thing that could help unlock that space is the DOE 1 gigawatt challenge, which should it move forward, could really help accelerate the velocity of learning as regards kind of community-supported development of solar projects and helping to reduce first costs and soft costs. Secondly, I would say, that the value of that community support is only so good, is so valuable insofar as it's passed through to customers. So I think by necessity, that value can be passed through kind of competitive procurement processes or requests for proposals, such that to the extent that there has been value created in adopting unified solar permits that allow for kind of more predictable development timeframes or smooth interconnection processes, that kind of value can only really be priced and captured for the customer through a really transparent and efficient market, which RFPs can help to create. And I think finally, in terms of addressing or creating scale, those RFPs can, in helping to pass through the real value of solar to customers, can ultimately help reduce customer acquisition costs, one of the leading barriers in kind of the solar market in general, to continued growth in the solar market. So what we saw actually in RFP processes that the SHINE program ran in the Southwest on behalf of some rural electric cooperatives was the price of power coming down between 30 to 40% over the recent market average. That is to about 5.5 to 6 cents per kilowatt hour. And as a result, kind of the demand from local co-ops more than tripling, just from them sharing the results with their friends. So I think that there is kind of a few really critical pain points, touch points that more effective support from communities and participation in the market can help reduce cost and provide broader access.
These have been really helpful responses. I'd be curious. No one in the response to this question has talked about the role for utilities yet, and this is a question we get often as well. I'm curious if anyone has any thoughts about how you see utilities beginning to play a role today, or your wish list for the role for utilities going forward, and what you see can be mutually beneficial.
Yeah, this is McGowan here. I'll check in on that one. Just in general, I feel like the utilities have been pretty great at least in the last 6 months of supporting our efforts, because we're in the multifamily side and we deal with demand charges and we are engaging that. That's a big concern for utilities, and if we can help them out there, then they're really happy to help us out. And so that relationship is, if we're adding batteries, or we also have, a software to engage users on the metering side and to help them respond to demand response events and things like that. So the utilities are quite helpful there. Where it's more difficult is just getting them to, sorry about the noise background, it's just getting them to pick up the phone. So just sort of a day-to-day operational side, I think that they could be a little bit more responsive, but once you do get them engaged, they're really improving. I give them the most improved award.
Kieran, you mentioned a New Mexico project that you're working with, and we know there's utilities involved in that one. Would you be willing to comment about the role of utilities going forward as you're seeing that play out?
Sure. So, thinking back to my initial comments on, part of the SHINE Community Solar Program's approach to providing support to buyers in the market today, we think that there are, as I said, buyer-owned levers that can really help reduce cost and the total cost of ownership. So with regards to utilities in the Southwest or communities in the Northeast, it's not cost shifting per se, but it's really the allocation of costs to where there is a comparative economic advantage, right? Because of relationships, networked access to information, and other benefits. So in the Southwest, utilities agreed to take on to their own books things like actually managing the the interconnection process more effectively, supporting developers with engagement of permanent zoning offices in their jurisdictions, as well as identifying sites that not only were more effective to provide grid benefits to their local distribution grids, but where it could actually be provided at cost or at a discount. So I think understanding that utilities and other groups that have the best interests of their be they customers or peers in mind, can take strategic steps to help reduce cost, and in so doing provide access in a way that credit enhancement can then just help further support. But first, cost reduction can help.
This is Isaac. I just would add, as a community solar developer with what it seems to be just an ever-growing wish list for utilities. We operate in now 3 states, and what we've seen basically is a huge range in utility response, where we've worked with everything from a municipal light district to mostly investor-owned utilities. So Con Ed in New York City has been wonderful. Eversource, who owns a bunch of utility space in Massachusetts, has been an absolute nightmare to deal with and has dug in their heels and raised costs every step of the way. National Grid in Massachusetts and New York has been delightful, as has Green Mountain Power. And so there's a lot of just whether the board and the decision makers at these like very increasingly consolidated large utility companies see solar as part of their future or not. And there are unfortunately still some who are digging in their heels and are making it really, really expensive to put solar on their grid. And I think, to a point that Kieran already made, the single simplest thing that utilities could do to proactively support smart development of solar would be to turn over just their GIS maps of what kind of wires they have and where they have it. And New York has had some success in making this happen. We haven't been able to get an inch of that in Massachusetts nor Vermont. And it means that people who are developing solar projects are shooting in the dark and just spending thousands of dollars asking the utility to go behind the scenes and to go look at what the infrastructure is like there, where we all know that they have that all mapped out and it's all there. So it's a very frustrating process of trying to figure out where the smart places are for where utilities should be adding solar to the grid in ways that are going to make it more effective and more clean and efficient to deliver solar to all customers. And so that's a huge area of opportunity for utilities. And then they have a lot of other opportunities in providing support on customer acquisition and a bunch of things that are being tried right now. But I really think that utilities putting together, like accepting that distributed generation is going to happen, and then putting together a plan that asks developers to put solar on these particular circuits to help with things like demand shaving and things like that would be amazing. And we just have not seen any utility push in that direction significantly in my experience thus far.
Wow, those were some really insightful answers. And thanks again, everyone on the panel, for answering our questions. I think we're going to pivot now to some of the questions we've been collecting all this time. So let's take our first question. So the question is, and this is for all of the panelists, how do your models reduce costs to low-income customers?
And maybe I think what this ask might be is, what are some of the nuts and bolts you can tell us in an easy in an easy, no slides kind of way?
Yeah, I'll start. This is McGowan again. I think just simply from aggregating the purchasing and sharing of the power, similar to how cooperative buildings and condo buildings work anyway, just as a natural fit there. I think you guys have also identified just transforming what we see as valuable. So I think there are a lot of intangible values that we could add in there on a case-by-case basis. And another thing that you guys helped me identify was the fact that people of different income backgrounds are lumped together so that they can get a better loan or better financing, which ultimately benefits some of the lower income participants.
I would add just quickly for CoOp Power that for ownership models, we basically say that any project we're going to build needs to pay back within 10 years, and we shoot to be under 8 from an investment standpoint. And for folks below 80% of median income, we have a rule that says that any project we build has to, from day one, save low-income residents at least 10% from their prevailing electricity rate that they're paying today. And because electricity rates are different in different areas, we're not able to work in everywhere we'd like to, but certainly in New York City, which has some of the highest electricity costs in the country, or other places like that, it's very easy to deliver solar at a price that is cheaper than what the existing utility costs are for electricity in that area. So that's in a nutshell. And all these other goals of reducing soft costs and through partnerships and things like that are just really focused around increasing that number to say, if 10% is our goal, what's it going to take for us to get to 20% by day one that we can reduce your electricity bill?
Yeah, I think I've spoken kind of in detail on how what we call community-supported development can help reduce costs by leveraging kind of a comparative advantage in local labor and time spent in the solar development process. I would just say, I think there's a certain scenario in which that we've seen play out across New York and Massachusetts where there's the opportunity to arbitrage local retail rates through net metering credits, and offering something like 5 to 10% guaranteed savings brings a certain number of customers on board. When really, if a more whole systems approach was taken to reducing first cost and the pre-development risk of projects by leveraging local community support, building local community support first, and expressing that support through soft cost reduction, you have the opportunity to pass through a much greater share of savings to customers, thus reducing at the end of the process the cost incurred when trying to acquire them.
Thanks. Another sort of nuts and bolts question, another ask here is, how are these models interfacing with the community?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because I think one thing that we hear a lot about is people are excited about community solar because of its kind of inherent community orientation, right? You have the opportunity to kind of leverage or build on sorts of solarized campaigns that existed in the residential sector previously, and I think there's the onus is really on kind of both the buyer side, as I've discussed at length, but also the supplier side, the seller side, to effectively create processes and platforms for engaging the community early and often. We've seen some developers try to set up kind of voluntary town halls and meetings in the process of saying, we're looking at putting solar on these sites. We'd like to invite comment early before we even go to solicit permits, right? Things like that can effectively create community buy-in and say, we want to provide effective, cost-effective solar access, that provides real material savings to households. It gets to a level where you could even assess distribution charges on top of it, and it would still be in the money and at a savings from what power costs today. And I think when you create that expectation and positive interest and virtuous cycles and community support for the projects, you create a much more scalable but kind of beneficial process for the communities that you work in.
This is Isaac. I would totally 100% echo those sentiments and think about community-led planning processes, or community-supported development, or whatever language we want to use. But bringing communities to the table before you start putting permits on the table, I think is one of the best ways to move this forward. And one of the things that we've found is also thinking about strategic points of engagement that aren't just the typical folks in the solar space who are running solarized campaigns. One of our big things we wanted to change in one of the cities we're working in Boston was we've had really low adoption rate among our neighborhoods that are primarily neighborhoods of color, and we wanted to figure out what our best ways of partnering with those communities were to really make these models accessible and led by communities, so that rather than communities feeling like they're last to the table and their only levers to pull on are to show up and to complain and to fight big developers coming into their space, to figure out how to bring those communities into the planning process has been a big part of our work. And a lot of that has happened through houses of worship, where we've started in communities by partnering with houses of worship to put solar on the churches themselves, and then using that as a framework for bringing in other community partners around those projects to think about the next things they want to do together. And the same has been true with CDCs, community development corporations, and a number of other, really partnering with long-term community-facing organizations who very clearly have the community's best interests at heart, so that if they're at the table and they're excited about what you're doing, we think that that's the best way to approach new communities who want to think about doing this work, or want to do it.
And as a corollary to that, Isaac, part of that community outreach might be to community banks who are active, in the local community, who understand and bank the folks in that community. Might be a better position to assess the risk profile of those who may participate in these projects and be a useful resource in trying to make them financeable.
All right. Go ahead.
Okay, I was just, this is McGowan from Brooklyn Power. I was just going to add a slightly different twist to that answer, and I think maybe some of the people, just to sort of clarify some of the differences between what we're doing and I think what is generally promoted as community solar. We're already operating within buildings, and so there is sort of like, we're focused on the community within a building. And I think that we believe that solar is a dream that everybody shares, and that to make that possible sort of opens up a lot of other things, particularly as a pathway to sustainability. So in terms of interfacing with community, what we want to do is use this, the bling of solar essentially, to get them on a pathway to do other things. So because we're dealing with buildings, we're also dealing with meters. We have a metering software that engages users and then helps them take the next steps in managing their energy consumption and sustainability in general. So I just wanted to add that sort of second perspective there, although I echo everything that they're saying about using local champions and things like that to engage the local community.
Thanks for that clarification, McGowan. And again, we want to encourage you to take a look at the report if you haven't, which details a lot of the intricacies of these different models, and also features some DERs outside of solar. Before we wrap up, we have some upcoming work we'd like to share with you, and also a little bit more about eLab. So first, I want to give a shout out to Kieran and the rest of our Shine team, who will be hosting a webinar on their work. I believe it's October 27th on community solar. And then our team.
Our team we're continuing to do research and profile other models out there for our network to be able to learn from. Check out our site. We have something new called the CDC solar model, which is, let's say, a fifth model that we've profiled. And we'll be publishing another insight in November with a few more. So check our resources site. I do want to say and remind all our listeners that eLab is a collaborative platform for leading discussions on issues related to the economic deployment of DERs. We're not a consensus organization, and the points of views expressed here are those of the speakers and not necessarily of eLab or of RMI. But on that note, thank you very much to our speakers. You provided some really needed insight, responding to some questions that RMI has gotten. And we hope, thank you to you listeners, that you've enjoyed this hour and keep checking back in with RMI on our eLab work.
And thank you everyone for submitting your questions. We have a bundle of questions on this side. We're writing them down, and we are going to do our best to take a look at those. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to contact the LEAP team, Kareena at cchan@rmi.org, or also Jason Meyer at jmeyer@rmi.org. Or you can check out our website, www.rmi.org/elab_leap. Again, thank you so much, everyone. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.